Well, I want to make sure this mic is working properly. If I talk this loud and move around, does it still pick up if I'm like this, still here over here? Okay. Well, I want to thank the people of St. Patrick's for cooperating with us again on this lecture series. I think we have a good one in store for you. People have a handout there, and part of it are some notes, maybe more than you ever want to know about the laity. And those notes, those are for people who want to do extra reading, I think. And then there's other things in that handout, too. I think there's a reminder of the other speakers who are coming, and which I hope people will find a way to get back for those. And then little bios on them, and sometimes there's books mentioned that people like to read ahead of time. You're welcome to do that. And then should be a reminder, Father Ray Brown is going to be coming here, and on Sunday, May 3rd at 7:30, internationally famous scripture scholar, I think the world's greatest expert on the Gospel of John, and that's the topic that he'll be dealing with. So for sure you don't want to miss that. Sunday, May 3rd, 7:30 p.m., and that will be, I'm sure, an intellectual treat for everybody. So why don't you pass the word and tell others about that. I think also we have another lecture in there that we have mentioned. And that's, my retreat, I see. Yes, retreat coming up. And then Pat Collins' lecture. So a lot of intellectual stimulation, things available. I think next week, Father Richard McCormick will be here. And again, he'll be talking about an important topic, assisted suicide. Well, the topic of the laity in the church, which is the one I want to address, and we'll do so for the next hour. That'll be our pattern, starting at 5:30, go to 6:30, couple of minute break, then an opportunity for people to leave comfortably. Anyone who wants to stay, then we'll have questions. But we're going to do them orally, but we're going to ask people to not make a speech connected with them, like get to the point of the question, and then the speaker will try to repeat the question. This is an alternative to what we tried, written questions last time. So we'll try to do it orally, but ask people not to give speeches, so on. Let me take one poll before I go on. That is, how many people here prefer the time of 5:30 rather than 5:15? I'm going to take a poll. First, who prefers 5:30 over 5:15? How many prefer 5:15? 5:30 wins. Well, that we changed as a result of the evaluations last year. So sounds, at least by this gathering, that 5:30 works better. So I'm on the topic of the role of the laity in the church. The question is, why did I pick that topic? And the reason is because this instruction came out of the Vatican not long ago. Now, some people remember it, some don't. It's on your notes. Appeared in the United States the first time early this year, and it created some controversy. And so that is what, made me decide to deal with this question of the role of laity. I'm going to get to the content of that, but that's why I picked that topic. But it has a far more meaning than that, is that apart from whatever the Vatican wrote about it in January, it becomes a crucial part of our life in the church, what the proper role of lay people are, how we laity and clergy relate, and so on. Now, even finding the right language for this is very difficult. The Vatican documents often talk about the non-ordained faithful. Well, not too many people like to be defined negatively. A lot of our friends remind us they didn't like to be called non-Catholics. Well, some of us are trying to learn not to define people as non-clerics or non-ordained. So finding the right language is difficult. One possible way to talk about it is that to talk about all the baptized, and then among all the baptized or the faithful, we find different groupings. We find some are lay people, others are religious, vowed religious, and others are clergy. So that might be one way to try to find a language that's going to work here. And then there's the whole question of the role of the laity is like an uplifting topic. I mean, rather than thinking, well, we got a Vatican document that upset people, to me, the topic of the laity is uplifting. Talking to Earl Leffler, my housemate, and he was talking about he's doing a prison retreat up in Milan, I think it was, and he's meeting with these men who did Curcio, and they're meeting to go up and plan to do this retreat for these people in prison, all these lay men. And Earl's saying, man, it's so inspiring to me. I mean, these guys are committed. They're into it. Then another time in the conversation, he told me, he says, well, I'm glad to be collaborating with them, but, my role isn't all that important. If I wasn't there, they'd do it anyway. So that one part, when we get into sort of uplifting conversation about lay people in the church, it's often inspiring to those of us who are members of the clergy to see this. It's a sign of hope. We got a lot of other problems, but it's a great sign of hope, it seems to me, in the church. I list some books for those people who read them. You can check those out, so on. There's one other story that comes to me about the role of the laity today. Bill Bausch tells it. I've told it before. He's a pastor in New Jersey, and he's got a wonderful, vibrant parish, and he's going to be gone this Sunday, and so he leaves, and he calls this other priest in to come and have the Mass on Sunday, and so everything's fine. He leaves, comes back on Monday, everything's going fine in the office, and about Wednesday, he finds out that the priest never showed up. And never showed up, but when he didn't show up, the people there gathered for the Eucharist, got themselves together, and people did the scripture readings, and somebody got up and gave a little reflection on it, and they distributed communion, and everyone went home and was sort of at ease with all of that. So much so they never even told the pastor that the priest didn't show up. Well, Bill Bausch likes to tell that story to point out how lay people have often taken charge in the church. I think the Vatican hears that story in a different way. And it's what creates part of the passion behind this document that was issued actually back in 1997. It's the same kind of thing that the passion that they would have for the television series Nothing Sacred. Nothing Sacred. I don't know if one of the episodes had this kind of situation. The three priests who were giving sanctuary to this couple from Latin America end up in confrontation with the police over this giving sanctuary, and all three end up in jail on Christmas Eve. And so all the people are assembled in the church, and for Christmas Eve, and Sister Maureen says, well, the priest shorty just hit us sooner than we thought. They always give her the good lines in that series. My favorite character. Well, Sister Maureen says, well, you ought to go over to this other church. You can still get there. And people say, no, we don't want to go. It's too late. We can't get in. They'll be crowded. So they say, well, you have the service. So this is my wife. Sister Maureen, there's not a Mass. There's not going to be a Mass. She makes it very clear. Not a Mass. But then she goes ahead and has the service and preaches this wonderful homily, and everybody, likes that, and sharing communion, consecrated hosts from other Masses. Well, the problem in the Vatican, as I see it, is that somebody is thinking, boy, we really like Sister Maureen's Mass. Sister Maureen's Mass is terrific. In other words, what we end up, from their viewpoint, is getting a confusion of roles, a confusion about ordained ministry and lay people, a confusion about communion services and Mass. I think that becomes part of the passion behind the document. Well, in the document, they repeat some of the things about the ministerial priesthood, and they play up its great importance and so on. And then they go into a part that says things that we shouldn't do. Now, part of the problem from people that I've talked to about this, and I was at the Common Ground Project in Milwaukee, March 5th to 7th, and the whole topic was about authority in the church, and this sort of issue got raised in private conversation. So some people told me their read on the whole thing, at least, that there was very little consultation on this document, and that therefore it wasn't picking up the real concerns, the real situations in various places, and there was very little time to review it by the bishops. And the English and Welsh bishops specifically said they were not consulted on this whole matter. So the feeling was there wasn't a lot of consultation, and therefore things maybe didn't get played out as well as one might like. But in the document, they stress what ought not happen. And they don't want lay people to be called chaplains, for example, or coordinators, or even moderator. I'm thinking at my parish we have a moderator of our Newman Club. Well, according to the language of the document, that they wouldn't like that, have a moderator of the Newman Club. So a lot of that problem probably has to do with the different situation here in the States. And there's a lot of other things they say ought not happen, so that lay people do not have a right to preach at Mass, and so on. Parish councils have only a consultative vote, not deliberative. Lay people cannot sort of preside at Mass, shouldn't wear stoles, and so on. I thought one of the interesting things that in the document was it said the idea of having on Sundays Sunday celebrations led by lay people, there's no priest, ought to be considered a temporary solution, temporary kind of situation. And I certainly would agree wholeheartedly with that. That can't be a good way for us to live as Catholic people. Well, they say a lot of other things that maybe people are going to be upset about, and I suppose one that sort of upset people was about the extraordinary ministers of the Eucharist, and insistence that if there are no priests there, that they should do all the distributing of communion, and lay people ought not to be doing that. And at the end, they remind us that the document wasn't given to defend clerical privileges, but in order to be faithful to the will of Christ. And I'm sure as this thing is played out, that's going to be extremely important, that how much of that has to do with the will of Christ and the pattern he set up. Now, the response to the documents, I was up in Detroit after this came out. They would have a big meeting of like 250 of their leading lay people in the diocese. And they had a Mass, and Cardinal Maida preached the homily at the Mass. And it was right after this document, so he had to say something about it. And Cardinal, he sent me a text of this ahead of time, because I was the speaker like after dinner. It's not a happy position to be in exactly, but anyway, he gave this homily at Mass. I saw the text of it, and his line was, well, all this abuse that they're talking about doesn't pertain in my diocese. In Detroit, we don't do any of these bad things, therefore, really don't have to worry much about it. I think that the Cardinal did not say a lot on that occasion about a more positive sense of what the laity were about, at least not from their viewpoint, a lot of the feedback I got. Part of the point I tried to make was, and I think we've learned from Vatican II, that is that baptized people have a lot of particular rights and responsibilities in the church by virtue of the baptism, and not just by delegation from the hierarchy. I happened to see the response of the English and Welsh bishops to the document. They said there's some nice things in there, a lot of encouragement for lay people, recognition that lay people have contributed a lot to the church by their holiness of life and so on, and presents an explanation of the ordained priesthood that we could build on and so on. And then they also say those abuses don't exist in our areas. This is the same strategy that the American bishops used when, at the turn of the century, when Pope Leo XIII condemned Americanism as a heresy, which said that this Americanism, Harry said that we were too relativistic in our approach, too hedonistic in this culture, and so on. And the American bishops turned it into what they called a phantom heresy. They simply said, well, those are very bad things that are being condemned, but they don't exist here in the United States. This Americanism heresy, their strategy was to call it a phantom heresy. It might exist someplace, but not here, and therefore we don't really have to worry about it so much. It might be helpful to distinguish out, questions like what we call chaplains. People who work in hospitals that I know, women, lay people, who are called chaplains, that just fits into their milieu. That's the standard terminology. Everyone recognizes them as a chaplain. And so it's hard to see how, that's in any way doing anything bad in terms of undercutting the ordained ministry. But then there are more serious questions they raise about the shortage of priests and parishes with no resident ordained ministers. I think we have to deal with that. Now, one of the responses to this was really strong. It was Bishop Stecker from Innsbruck, and that's been in the news. He responded very negatively to this document, and he used it as a springboard to attack the Vatican, and after which he then retired. Bishop. I think his opening line was, before I lay down my crozier, I have one more thing to say. But his fundamental point, as I got it, was that the Vatican is too interested in preserving their privileged status and not doing enough about taking care of the sacramental and pastoral needs of the people. He used it as a springboard, as I say, to attack many different things. But he uses a lot of personal examples, like, geez, you got people who are sick and need the administrations of priests and people, and here we are worried about all of these ways in which the laity might be out of line. So he really thought that the Vatican ought to concentrate more on pastoral concerns and how we build up the body of Christ, and not so much in criticizing particular things that lay people were doing. Well, I just think it's good for us to belong to a universal church. Well, it's good to have a transnational church. There's certain positive things in that, because to have a transnational church means there's people outside of our culture who say things about what Christianity is all about in the contemporary world that can get us thinking. In other words, any time we're in a closed group, like living in the U.S. culture, it's easy to get just fixated on certain elements of it and get narrow-minded and tunnel-visioned and not see bigger questions. So many times it seems to me that when things come out of Rome, they have a power to start discussions and debates and force us to look at ourselves in different ways and to see what's happening with us. And that's sort of the way that I have wanted to use this document, to revisit this question of the laity, which would be the first time it's really revisited in a strong way in the media as a whole, or the church as a whole, since 1987. That's when we had the synod in Rome about the laity, and if you remember, that generated all kind of articles and discussions and wonderful things, and many contributions of lay people to understanding their role and looking at the church. So this document isn't going to spark anything like that, because but it allows us to rethink the laity question, perhaps. I think that the strategy of Cardinal Maida is probably the strategy the church is going to adopt as a whole. There's a committee set up to study the document. That means, like a long time to think about it, and without doing much about it, I think. At least that's my conversations with Cardinal Maida led me to think that that was his strategy, and probably one that he shared with a lot of other people. So that takes us back to the substantive question of the role of the laity, and for us to reflect on what's happened on this whole issue for 3 decades now, since the council. In a sense, to think about our experience in interacting, clergy and lay people, and what we've learned, the mistakes we've made, and ways in which we might try to move forward. Now, as I often do, I want to take an historical approach to this, and for my own reasons, I've segmented it out. I want to take a long, broad historical look at just the whole question, and then I want to come back and look at it from a distinctively U.S. experience. And the purpose of that history is to somehow get some perspective on the question as we deal with it today. Well, we, as Christians, we always go back to Jesus. You know? And it's crucially important that we understand Jesus in his cultural, historical milieu, his religious milieu of 2,000 years ago. And when we look at Jesus in the light of all of this, what jumps out at one is that Jesus was a layman. Well, now, you know, the letter of the Hebrews calls Jesus a high priest, but that is later reflection. In his own circumstances, Jesus was not a priest. He didn't go into the temple on the Day of Atonement and offer sacrifice for everybody else. He wasn't a trained priest. Nor was he, for that matter, a monk. No, he had the option of becoming an Essene. Could have gone into the monastery at Qumran at the Dead Sea Scrolls, become a monk. He chose not to do that. And what he did, it seems, is start a largely lay movement within Judaism itself to try to reform Israel, be more faithful to the covenant, so that they really could be a light to the nations. So it's interesting. You think, go back to the foundings of our religion. What was Jesus about? You know, he started this movement, and he himself was a lay person, and attracted mostly lay people to the movement. Very few priests joining him in this whole endeavor. In fact, they're the ones who didn't like what he was doing largely. And well, I mean, to jump ahead on the point, it really seems odd to have a movement 2,000 years later started by a layman and end up with a movement that sort of looks like, at lay people, like they're second-class citizens in the church. That's to telescope the history here. Well, it just is strange. One of the great oddities of history, that a movement founded by a layman and with largely lay impetus to the beginning would end up thinking that lay people were second class in the movement. Very strange. Well, the history of that is murky. I mean, how that happened through the first and second, third centuries. But the outline of it is something like this. By the end of the first century, you already had a situation where one person ended up being in charge of a grouping of the followers of Jesus. Now, up till that point, you didn't have that. If you think of the community at Corinth, Paul doesn't write to the bishop in Corinth and tell him, get this straightened out. In Corinth, you got a situation, a charismatic community where people have different gifts and they're using them and to build up the body of Christ, to further the Jesus movement. And they get all kind of trouble in this, and they can't seem to get it all together, and they got problems. But there's clearly nobody in charge there, no resident person. So you got a lot of charismatic communities of Christians through that first century. But as time goes on, they move into a mode of saying there's this overseer who's presiding over the community. Well, as time goes on, that overseer ends up taking more and more power and using more and more the structures of the Roman Empire as an organizational pattern. And more there's a feeling that the group needs to control these charismatic elements. They would be especially represented by the Montanists. They were people, the leader of that group, Montanus, said that he was like an incarnation of the Spirit, that he was especially enlightened by the Spirit, and he was going to help other people to be Spirit-filled, and women had a role to play in that. He had two prophetesses who were very important in his whole movement. So he represented this other charismatic element that we saw at Corinth getting continued on into the 2nd century. And that movement, you see, gave free scope to everybody. I mean, males and females fared well in that setup. There was no reason why women couldn't have that spirit and do prophecy and do all kind of important things in the community. As the thing became more structured and took on the patterns of the patriarchal culture, it had to become more male-dominated. Soon as, because that's how the whole empire was, that's how the whole society was. So the more they took on the trappings of the empire and the political structures, the more patriarchal and sexist it would become. Just necessarily so. I mean, I don't think there's any way around it. If you got rid of that, if you thought Jesus is going to be coming back real soon and we don't need these other structures and everyone's got the Spirit and some people do this and some people do that to build up the body of Christ, then you get a greater equality in it all. So in the beginning, you start out, no big distinction between clergy and laity. And then that distinction comes in the 2nd, 3rd century with people like Origen, and as soon as they start talking like that, they introduce the word laikos in the Greek. That word laikos, which we now translate laity, took on a pejorative meaning. Right off the bat, in Alexandria, Clement of Alexandria and in Origen, you find the idea that, well, this other group that came to be called the clergy had the inside track and knew what everything was about, and you had this other mass of unenlightened, uneducated people who largely had to be kept under control in certain ways. So that becomes the pattern as you go along, and it just gets increased by the time of Constantine. The church is sort of embedded in the church structures and so on, in the structures of the empire. By the 11th century, I quote Gratian as saying, there are two classes, duo genera, two classes, Gratian said, in the church, the clergy and the laity. And then that sort of thing continues all the way up to our own time. Now, here's a quote from Pius X in 1906. The point would be that this just got stronger and stronger, this division between clergy and laity. Laity less and less important. And here's what Pope Pius X said in 1906. The one duty of the multitude, that's like all the laity, is to allow themselves to be led, and like a docile flock, to follow the pastors, with a capital P. There's the one duty, well, and we had our own way of saying that. That was our translation of Pius X was to pray, pay, and obey, as sort of what lay people are all about. Now, what is the sort of the import of that history? The import is it raises the theological question about how normative the structure is that began to prevail is. In other words, the Vatican document says this is the will of Jesus, that this is the constitutive element in the church, and we need to be organized the way we are. In other words, they say the fact that lay people can't preach, or if they do preach, it's not by any right, it's only by delegation. The claim is that's the way Jesus set it up. That's the inherent essential structure. And of course, when some theologians look at that history and say, well, we don't know about that. Maybe that structure is not as normative as one might have thought. Now, always within the church, there's been a tension between that charismatic element and that institutional historical element, all throughout our history. I think myself it's a necessary tension, and I think it can be a fruitful one. So all the way through, there's been counter movements. Now, we've always saw lay saints. I picked out St. Monica, a mother, St. Augustine's mother, raised up as a saint for the church, lay person, holy. Then there's the Beguines. The Beguines were the interesting group in the late Middle Ages. These were lay women, mostly in the Low Countries, would be Holland, Belgium. They still exist in Belgium. There's still Beguines in Belgium today. I find that fascinating. But they said they wanted to be holy. And they were opposed. The dominant outlook was something like this. The only holy people were the monks, the ones that left the world and went into the desert and the monasteries, or the clergy. The lay people about the best they could do, given all the temptations in the world, corrupt society, everything, was to avoid mortal sin and sort of sneak into heaven. Well, the Beguines rejected that. And the Beguines said, no, we want to live in the world, we want to keep our jobs, keep our normal occupations, but try to be really holy. Be holy in the world. And I can tell you, the Beguines started out, they had the papal support, and before long they lost favor with the hierarchy, and there was a great effort to stamp them out. And despite that, they still managed to continue to exist, at least in small numbers. So I see that as an alternate way of thinking about what it means to be a Christian lay person. Cardinal Newman emerges as a great hero in all of this. Was it in dialogue with Cardinal Manning? I'm a little blocking on this a little bit about, well, what do we care about the laity? And Newman's response was, the church would look pretty foolish without them. Well, Newman had a reason for that, historical reason. What really converted him to Catholicism from Anglicanism, this is in the 19th century now, he spanned the century, as you might know. Newman studied the period of the Arian heresy in the early church, and his startling conclusion was that the laity were more faithful to authentic doctrine during the Arian heresy than the bishops. So he writes about on consulting the faithful in matters of doctrine. So Newman, as in many other ways, was a great harbinger of what would come in the Second Vatican Council. Throughout the 19th, 20th century, the church was recognizing more and more, especially after the time of Pius IX. I'm big on his history tonight, aren't I? Well, quickly. Pius IX, Syllabus of Errors, 1864, condemns everything modern, like religious liberty, democracy, freedom of the press, condemns all of that. Church is sort of out of touch with the modern world, but then we start losing people. And then the popes began to think, especially Pius XI and Pius XII into the 20th century, thinking, this can't be. We need the lay people to keep afloat here. We need the lay people to help Christianize the world. We're going under here. The secularized world is too strong for us. We have to find our ways to counterbalance that. So they developed what they called Catholic action. Catholic action meant that they were deputizing, delegating lay people to do these wonderful things in the world. They didn't say lay people have this right by baptism to go Christianize the work site or whatever, but they said we're delegating people to do that. That was the fundamental notion behind Catholic action. Well, other things we recovered. Pius XII wrote an encyclical on the mystical body, helped us see Paul's idea that everyone's got a role to play in all of this, and people rediscovered other elements in the tradition and so on, and we end up with Vatican II. And Vatican II now is, in the light of this kind of history, is remarkably radical. They wrote a document on the laity. That's the first time in the history of the church that a document, an official document by council, was written on for the laity. That's remarkable. And not only that, but they reversed a 2,000-year thing in which laity was seen as a pejorative term and made it a positive term. They turned that whole thing around, and they said that all of us, all the baptized, are called to holiness. All the baptized share in the universal priesthood of Christ. All of us are co-responsible for the church. all those wonderful themes. And in the notes you'll see some quotes for people in documents, but I'm just going to read a couple of them here. They say that all the baptized share a true equality with regard to the dignity and to the activity common to all in building up the body of Christ. The lay people should be respected as far as possible and curtailed only, the freedom of lay people, curtailed only when and insofar it is necessary. So he took the position that freedom for lay people should be the order of the day and only be curtailed if it was necessary. All of this is a tremendous reversal of the dominant trend throughout. We've got the quote about all the faithful, called to the perfection of charity, and so on. Then urges pastors, I'd like this, listen to the laity willingly, consider their wishes in a fraternal spirit, recognize their experience and competence in the different areas of human activity, so together they can work to read the signs of the times. And then finally, in certain occasions, pastors should invite the laity to undertake works on their own initiative. Invite initiative and creativity, which I think is a wonderful pastoral approach to all of this. Now, since the council, a lot of important things have happened. I want to link this into the American experience, if I can do that now, because I think that what happened with the council, we in the United States heard it in a distinctive way because of our history. And our history is different from Europe in regards lay people. And let me try to summarize this thing in this way. There were not many Catholics in the colonies, but the ones who were there took a lot of initiative in keeping the faith alive. They had to do it because there weren't a lot of priests around. Then when we got the period of the immigrants, starting in 1820 and all the way up to 1920, a common pattern was this. The laity would come from Europe, and they would go to parts of the country where there were other people of the same national background. So a lot of Polish people came here to Toledo. A lot of German people went to Cincinnati. And the pattern was something like this. They would get there, join together, often form some fraternal kind of organization, and then they would collect money. And they didn't have much, remember. They didn't have jobs. They were hard to get jobs. They were struggling. Collect money. What would they do with it? Buy property. Typically, build a church. Then go look for a priest. Ask the bishop to try to get them a priest, or find a priest themselves. That set up a pattern that we came to know as lay trusteeism. I see some of my brother priests in the room. At a certain time that when we studied, lay trusteeism was one of the worst words you could think of in the seminary. Shades of lay trusteeism. It was like a horrible thing. And of course, what lay trusteeism meant was that the lay people in the parish used to vote for trustees. I must say, only the men voted. And only usually the people who paid pew rent voted. But they voted and elected these trustees. And these trustees then were in charge of the parish. And they tried to run a lot of things. They did run a lot of things, a lot of the temporal affairs, but also some spiritual things. And the real nub of the fight was who would get the priest? Who would have the power to hire the priest and to fire him? And that, throughout the 19th century, became a big part of the fight. Who would have that power? And, I mean, it just went round and round. I mean, it was a terrible kind of situation, often issued in fights, where there was an Irish parish, if I'm trying to remember all of this, in Philadelphia. They got into a fight over who could hire the priest, and it led to riots. There was one Slovak parish, and this is late already in the, it's a Polish parish, late in the 19th century, where they described what went on in church over this. I mean, they was throwing hymnals at one another and stomping their feet and getting into all these fights. In one place, there was a couple hundred people injured. Of course, my favorite story was the Slovak women who didn't like the fact that the bishop had appointed the priest of the parish. They wanted to appoint him. And so then the priest came in the rectory. They went and attacked the rectory. And the priest had to go barricade himself up in the attic. And the police had to come. The women were going to tear the house down. So, I mean, this gives some flavor for what was going on here in the 19th century. Now, you had other places like Charleston where those things seemed to work quite well, and in Cincinnati as well, where lay trusteeism seemed to work well. There was a sort of a collaborative mode between the bishop and the congregation. I think it was Bishop England in Charleston who said that he didn't want the laity to dominate, but to collaborate in this whole appointment of the priests. So this is quite an amazing kind of history that we're heir of. Now, by the time you got to 1920, all that was gone. So this whole era where the lay people had such a heavy role, and they felt ownership of their parishes, they had built them, and they tried to get the kind of priests they wanted and all of that. By 1920, the pendulum had swung totally the opposite way. And that congregational model, if we can use that word, gave way totally to a heavily clericalized model, where the pastor really was the pope in his own parish. We talk about the brick and mortar pastors, the ones who did it another way. They built the parish, they built the church and the school, they got the lay people to help them do it, and then they got appointed to that parish for a long time. And they were very much in control. And so much did that happen that the Catholic lay people in the United States forgot their history. That is, a lot of Catholic lay people have no remembrance of that at all, no perception that indeed there was a period of time when the pendulum was really on the other side. So it seems to me when the Second Vatican Council then came that this renewed role of the laity and all those fundamental theological issues, all the baptized are co-responsible, universal call to holiness, all of those kind of themes, I think woke up something in the Catholic laity, maybe some distant remembrances or some democratic spirit, something from this United States of ours that cherishes freedom and initiative and creativity and wants participation. All that seemed to catch in a way. As I travel around and talk to people, it seems to me the one thing out of Vatican II that's caught more than anything else is summarized in this phrase: we are the church. I hear it over and over. You hear it from even, quite conservative people, liberal people. We are the church. It's like that part of the message ended up resonating with our American psyche. Somehow with this U.S. culture of ours where we prize freedom and responsibility and all of that. So when we heard that from the council, then I think we were in a position to pick up on it. And now we've had this great flowering of lay ministers, people reading the scriptures at Mass and in celebrating Eucharist, the kind of thing that Earl was talking about, people making these trans-parochial things like Curcio, marriage encounter, beginning to find their own spirituality and all of that. Of course, there were questions about all of this, and tensions developed within this whole movement. One was represented by a lot of lay people in Chicago. It's often called the Chicago Declaration. Is that right? Well, I didn't sound right when I said that. But anyway, people will recognize it. What they ended up saying was, this is good, what's happening in the church, these Chicago lay people, we're laity and all that, but there's a big danger. And the big danger is that people, Catholics, are going to just get too introverted, too much energy into being a Eucharistic minister, into doing things at the liturgy and doing intramural things. And we're in great danger, they said, of forgetting the other part of lay ministry, which is to Christianize the world, to humanize society, to animate with Christian principles this temporal order of ours. They felt there was a great danger in that. We give a great play, we bless Eucharistic ministers and so on, and play that up, and that we're not doing enough to bless and recognize and treasure the people who are involved in social justice work, the apostolate of reaching out and so on. Well, the other, of course, great tension area that arises is the whole question of the role of women in the church. And the history, as we can see, turns against women in the church early on. In the Montanist groups, women could play a full role. And there were other cultural things against the patriarchal society. But as time goes on, that is lost. Even in the United States, through the colonial period and the immigrant period and so on, it was only the men who ran the parishes. Only men were lay trustees. No women were involved in any of those roles. So as we move into the post-Vatican II period and try to work this out, we find so many women coming forward and participating in the life of the parish, enriching it in so many ways, doing a whole lot of the background work to make the whole thing run. Women being far more than half of the pastoral ministers and parish leaders throughout the United States, and then running into their own version of the glass ceiling and not being able to be ordained. And of course, as soon as you raise the question of laity and you raise the question of charisms, free gifts of the Spirit, and wanting to use them, you have some women who say, my charism would be to lead the community, to be the presider at the Eucharist, to preach the homilies and so on, and I'm not able to do that. So that, I think, becomes, an issue that it will, somehow we have to deal with that. Part of my own sense of it is that we need to always maximize the possibilities of women doing things in the church. My own image is sort of pressing against the edges all the time, the edges of what's allowed, that we have to try to find ways for women to be able to use their gifts. The whole question of women's ordination becomes so much touchier. I can just say my own teacher, Karl Rahner, in addressing that issue and the shortage of clergy and how we would solve all of this, had a radical solution that he had proposed publicly to the German bishops in the early 1970s and is found in his book, The Shape of the Church to Come. And Rahner says the Christian community should never be without its ordained leaders, never, and that every Christian community should surface the real leader within the community, the one with the gifts, the talents for leadership, and that's the person who should preside at the Eucharist, and that's the person who should preach the homilies, and that's the person who should be ordained by the bishop. And Rahner said, those who say that that's an impossible solution, that the burden of proof is on them. The people who would deny that as a viable solution would need to prove why. On what basis would one say that? And of course, that brings the whole argument back to that history of the New Testament. Jesus picked no women as members of the 12. We know there were women apostles, though. That's a good thing to remember. Remember Junius, listed in the last chapter of the book of Romans, who's called an apostle. So we had women apostles right in the first time, but we had no women as a member of the 12. It's very important to distinguish 12 the resident witnesses to the we're with Jesus from the beginning, his baptism until his resurrection, the core group representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and apostles. We have other women apostles, but we don't have women as members of the 12. And so the argument is Jesus didn't pick anybody, women as members of the 12. He could have done that, and therefore that's normative. If we can have women as the official leaders in the community. And others in honor would say, well, it wasn't really possible for Jesus to pick a woman as the 12. The patriarchal culture wouldn't allow it. And so the argument goes back and forth on that particular question. But certainly, I think it's all raised up for us to continue to think about that. When you think of the theology of all of this, my sense is that we haven't solved it. That there's Steve Congar back in 1953 wrote a really important book on this, lay people in the church, and he says we need a solid theology of the laity, sort of a consistent, comprehensive, solid theology of the laity, and I think we haven't found that. And like so many other questions that are bedeviling us these days, the roots go back to Vatican II. Because in Vatican II, as on so many questions, there were compromises. Because you had more conservative bishops, more liberal bishops, and their compromises represented in the documents. So in one place, it says that it's really the lay responsibility to Christianize the world. And so you get the impression it's their responsibility to figure out how you do it, what's the best way to do it, take all that effort and feed it back into the church. But then you get other places where it talks about the hierarchy directing that whole activity to sanctify the world. So that kind of ambiguity is right in the council documents and has continued to plague us. We haven't been able to work out much of that since. I'd like to raise up the figure of Dorothy Day as being important when we talk about lay ministry and lay initiative. She represents to me a certain ideal on how one would look at all of this. Dorothy Day, a convert to Catholicism, as you might know, the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, took initiative to bring the gospel to the world. She established those wonderful hospitality houses, started the paper, The Catholic Worker. David O'Brien calls her the most influential Catholic in the whole history of the United States. So an amazingly important person. And yet Dorothy Day was totally faithful to the church. I mean, she had her really strong arguments with Cardinal Spellman over the gravediggers strike and so on, and they were at odds and loggerheads and really strong. But she said there was no problem with her coming to Mass celebrated by Cardinal Spellman and receiving communion there. In other words, she represents to me initiative and creativity and strength and impact, and yet she found her way to stay within the fold, to be a faithful, loyal member, and to participate in the Eucharistic celebration, even with people with whom she disagreed strongly. To me, it's some sort of a model of the internal life of the church, of how we might try to work out this relationship between the laity and the clergy. To me, the essential element is trust. At the Common Ground Project in Milwaukee, that was a theme, and we had background papers by people like Avery Dulles and so on. And out of all of that, what came out so clearly was trust. When we started to think of the clergy-lay relationship, theologically, it's awfully hard to figure it out. It's hard to get a theology that we all agree on or that can solve all of our problems. We got the one priesthood of Christ, and we all share in it by virtue of baptism, universal priesthood. Some are ordained, 2% of the church are ordained to be clergy, to carry out the role. We are to be servants, all of that. Well, that is, sort of an attempt to get at a theology that might start to bind us together. But really, deep down, what counts is the trust, the mutual trust that exists within any parish, within a parish staff, within all of clergy and laity as we try to interact. If we trust one another, if we can honestly dialogue, we attribute goodwill to one another and really feel that, then we can work some of it out. If we don't have the trust, when that breaks down, and I know parishes where that's happened, and then nothing can happen. Then you can try everything, and nothing works because you can't get the cooperation at that level. So to me, no authority structure works in a modern democratic world without the trust factor. And where we believe that the other person has at least as good a will as we have about trying to build up the body of Christ and do this action in the world. And final point in the last couple minutes here, not only when we look at the role of laity, there's an internal role. Eucharistic ministers, lectors, catechists within the church, parish administrators. We got all these different roles within the church. But we also have what the Chicago people were worried about, that external role. Have to take the gospel out. Now, one place where I think we get a sort of agreement is the hierarchy is always saying that's the really proper role of the laity. There we don't have much argument since the time of Pius XI and Pius XII that the lay people are going to have to Christianize this world. Lay people are going to have to bring the gospel to the work site. We're not going to make a better society unless Catholic lay people are involved in the public square, and we make our contribution. And in doing that, the role of the laity, there's sort of three touchstones that I would have. One, that the approach would be dialogic. That is, the Catholic lay people would come to the Christianizing of the world saying that we have a message here, we have something important to contribute, and we want to have that voice, but we will listen, we will learn. We don't come at it as Catholics with all the answers, like some of our fundamentalist friends sometimes portray themselves in the public realm. We Catholics come at it as saying that we want to enter into dialogue, we want to teach, but we want to learn. Dialogic process. Second kind of touchstone for me would be that ought to be dialectical. By that I mean that when we come to the culture as a whole, we ought to be able to say yes to certain trends, yes to the wonderful freedom we have in this culture, yes to a model of self-actualization that remembers the common good, yes to a lot of the good things in our culture, but then the willingness to challenge the negativity, challenge the sexism, the racism, the excessive nationalism, the individualism, the consumerism, to be able to say no to all of that. And to do that, my third point about approach to this is with a modest confidence. That we nourished in the Eucharist, nourished by the liturgy, by this long Catholic heritage of ours, grace but sinful as it is, that we really can contribute something, that we're important as Christian people, baptized people. We got this wonderful heritage, and we can share it. A modesty about it, however, that doesn't want to push it down people's throats and come on as being too overbearing or self-righteous, but willing to somehow learn from the culture. Well, we role of the laity is a controversial one, and I left a lot of questions hanging and be very open to trying to deal with them. Just remind you for this series, Father McCormick will be here next week at 5:30. There's a lot of great speakers along the way, and I hope that people will make plans to come, and I hope you will tell others about it and remind people of the various lectures in your handout, and especially remember Ray Brown right here in this place. Come early, might be filled up to hear the greatest scholars on the Gospel of John on May 3rd. So let's take just a couple minutes stand-up break so people can leave easily, and those who want to stay will have questions and comments.